So, chapter 12 is the chapter of the day here. Now, this is a little bit more on the social and emotional development. Now, one of the first things that I noticed is that the book doesn't use the right terminology for things in some cases. And the very first thing it does, first page of chapter 12, before you even get into the meat of the chapter, is it talks about how children like to use clicks so that they can develop a sense of self without intimacy. And what a horrible thing to do, to use the word intimacy wrong. Intimacy is actually a word that we use in science, and it has absolutely nothing to do with sex. The proper definition of intimacy is how comfortably familiar you are with someone. So the first person you were ever intimate with most likely was your mother, because this is the person you were very comfortably intimate with. She would hold you. You would feel very comfortable around her. You could tell her things, talk to people. To say that a clique in high school isn't intimate is, I don't know what else it could be. The whole point is that you're supposed to be comfortable around these people, which is the very definition of intimacy. To use this just as some vulgar definition of sex is absolutely preposterous. By the way, because I hadn't mentioned this previously, the word vulgar is probably one of the most poorly used words in the English language. Vulgar means of the common people. And dictionaries these days really give very poor definitions. They're more about making money than they are defining words. So what they'll usually do is they'll give several ways that the word is used commonly, but that doesn't actually tell you what the word means. So if you look up the word vulgar, for example, in the dictionary, you'll see a whole bunch of ways it can be used, and you have to kind of see an overarching theme. And you'll see that the theme is that vulgar means of the common people, what common people do. You'll notice the same thing with words like hypocrisy, and the word cheat, for example, is another one that we use. And I ask you to think about these things because psychology and communication are very closely tied, because it's how we express ourselves and how we think about how we express ourselves. That's going to be how we come across, and how we can analyze how other people think. And critical thinking is really kind of a key issue with developmental psychology. So if you take the word cheat, you could look up in the dictionary and see 100 different ways that it's used. But the fact of the matter is that it's they all, we use this a lot of different ways. You can cheat on taxes, you can cheat on your spouse, you can cheat on a test, and yet we use this word very comfortably because we know what it means. It means that you have rules that have been broken and that you've kind of deceived, and maybe there's a few other things that you have to do, but it's definitely broken rules that have been deceived. But they don't actually mention that in the dictionary. So keep that in mind if you start looking up words, during any parts of your schooling, to see what they mean. That you're going to have to kind of figure out on your own what they mean based on all these things as to how they're used. But intimacy was just flat out used incorrectly in the book, which is a shame. Now, Erikson's stage for adolescence is identity versus role confusion. And for once, they actually talk about what happens if you mess up, and then you'll have role confusion. You'll just kind of, in modern terms, you'll be a slacker. You'll be 25 years old, still living in your mom's basement, and just have no idea where you should be or what you should do. And this is kind of the question of what should I be when I grow up. And this is a very social issue. Because it's completely dependent on culture. It's dependent on how much you steer the child into what they'll be when they grow up. Because there's 100 different options. I mean, let's face it, if you were to go into a movie store, if for those of you old timers that actually remember what a Blockbuster was, it would have made your life so much easier if they just had like 5 movies on a shelf. One said comedy, one said drama, one said action, one says romance. You say, okay, well, I'm in the mood for a romance, and you go and you pick up a romance. and then you have your movie. But instead, it's so much more difficult because there's a million movies there, and you got to figure out what even genre they are. And this is essentially what a lot of people do to a teenager, and they think it's a good idea to have this free-range teenager thing. Let them choose for themselves without any steering or any direction whatsoever when they have no idea about any of this stuff. Heck, even when we get into the next stage where we get into college, you'll notice that there's a very similar problem here because there's a lot of people who will go to college, seek out a career, and a lot of you I know are now in this for a second career because the first career didn't work out so well. Because you study a career, and then once you actually get into the career, you find out that you don't even really like it because you did all this studying, but they never actually showed you what it was about, what it was like to do the career. And then you find all the people in it suck or something like that. So this is the whole problem of identity versus role confusion that's going on in this particular stage, where they want to figure out where they fit in life, and if they don't, they're going to have to solve this one way or the other before they can really move on to other problems. So if they never really figure out what they want to be when they grow up, what they're going, how they're going to fit in with the rest of the world, be part of the game, they'll never really get to go to these other stages. On a very clinical level, one of the worst things about, and in some ways some of the most interesting things about welfare recipients is the fact that they can often not solve this particular problem of where they fit in the world, because without a career, without a lot of these different things in this current society, they don't really have much of a place. They're just kind of on the sidelines watching everybody else play the game. And so this kind of halts their development as an adult. On the other hand, a fascinating study was done with trying to figure out exactly what people would do when they didn't really have a place that society accepted. And so what they did is they went to homeless people, because this is a group of people, and we're not talking about homeless down on their week for a couple of weeks, so they're in a shelter, or down on their luck for a couple of weeks. We're talking about people who are like career homeless. They haven't had they've been living on the streets for years, and they know they will for years more. And so they interviewed them, and they kind of figured out where they fit in the whole self concept. Where do you belong? And oddly enough, these people had a great deal of pride in what they did, which we as scientists didn't expect, because we haven't been in that situation and we didn't see it coming. And so they would have their roles. They would solve this problem. They would have their identity. So like one group were the dumpster divers, and they would pride themselves on being a dumpster diver. And it's like, no, this is what we do. It's a skill, know what dumpsters to go into, what time, where the good stuff is, what you can sell, what you can't. Then you'd have the beggars, and they were, split up into the categories of the pathetic beggars and the talented beggars, and that was a totally different thing there. You had the people that would go from one shelter to another, and they'd really know the system so that they could exploit that, and that's what they were proud of. And each person had a hierarchy. Like the dumpster diver would say, well, I'm better than a beggar, but I don't know the system. Like the system guy would be, like a step up as far as the dumpster diver would go. Actually, if I remember right, the divers were the highest category of people, because they basically considered they had a job. They had things they could do for money. But either way, even for these people that we would not think would have solved this problem, they have no role. They will find a role, and they will take pride, and they will have a hierarchy, and they'll have an in-group and out-group, and we're better than them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little while. Now, in this, they talk, like she will the rest of the book, a lot about self-esteem. And yes, she does word it like there's no upper bound of self-esteem. But one of the tricks is that this opinion of self-esteem, as I mentioned before, is very modern, and it's very likely to change during your adulthood. You will see how we're supposed to relate to self-esteem. Right now, we're on a kind of a version of unconditional love, and in this culture we love the idea of unconditional love. We say we should unconditionally love our children. We should unconditionally love our our spouses. And this is a very modern view that we put on our adolescents. They are loved unconditionally, and it is changing them. It is changing them rather drastically because there are no conditions. Throughout the rest of history, there has always been conditions. You know, you could fail as a son. You could fail as a father. You weren't loved just because you were you. And this strove you to excel, or drove you to do something anyway. And so we're starting to see drawbacks now of this unconditional love. And so I would wager, from a historical perspective, you guys can see in your lifetime, within 20 years, we probably will no longer believe in unconditional love, unconditional self-esteem, and the idea that you're special just because you're you, which, as I mentioned last time, is unrealistic anyway. The chance of actually being special is quite small. Now, since we're talking about the social natures at this point, and last time I talked about the cognitive nature, about how these people think that they're special, it's important to notice that, yes, these children are really, they're striving to adhere to social norms. They're conforming on a huge scale, while at the same time thinking that they're special. For those children who are actually special, who are actually unique, who would essentially qualify as an eccentric, life is incredibly difficult for them. It is difficult to be an eccentric. You know, I mentioned Michael Jackson as an eccentric that's well known. That man was persecuted every single day of his life. Everybody made an opinion on all of his actions without any actual knowledge whatsoever. He was accused of sleeping with little boys, and people either said yes he did or no he didn't, even though none of us had any data. Zero data. We had a bunch of tabloid crap that we got fed, and that justified us in deciding whether or not this man was a pedophile, which is a huge, huge accusation to make, but we're very comfortable in that. And we're very comfortable based on the fact that this man was an outsider to us. He was not one of us. He was different. And so the man was persecuted until the day he died. There's some pretty realistic theories that maybe he just faked his own death and left, got yet more plastic surgery so no one would recognize him, because he was just tired of the constant life of persecution, which is relatively feasible. A lot of people would do it if they had the options. So the idea of conforming, the reason teenagers do it so much is because they need to. The social ramifications of actually being unique are incredible. You can't get a job if you're unique. Who would want to hire you? You're not just hiring somebody to, be a cashier. If you're hiring a cashier, you're hiring somebody you're going to have to hang out with for 8 hours a day. If they're just weird, if they're unusual, you're going to throw a lot of people off. You're going to make some customers uneasy because you're not what they expect. And if they see something they don't expect, that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So this is where the role confusion comes in. You basically don't fit in this grand social machine if you're a cog you shaped yourself. Don't correct the teenagers, by the way, and tell them that no, you're not really unique, and they won't believe you anyway. This is about facts, not how it makes them feel. One thing that I do want you to do is table 12.1. It talks about different identity statuses. Definitely know that. It's worded very well. The next page, though, on page 317, there's a chart that is 100% useless, and it's the thing that I want you to ignore. And while telling you why to ignore it, I want you to be able to think critically about what is in there. I want you to read it, especially if anybody's going to go into any sort of like social work or psychology or nursing or anything where you're actually going to have to give people advice. I do want you to read the chart on page 317 and really think about why it's useless. And I'll give you two examples. Some of the recommendations that they have, these are recommendations for how you can help an adolescent build their identity. It says, engage in warm, open communication. That is so vague and poorly worded that no one can actually do it. Oh, warm, open. Well, now that I know I have to engage in warm, open communication, it's easy. Just engage in warm, open communication. Another one is initiate discussions that promote high-level thinking at home and at school. This sounds like the sort of junk that a human resources department would write as its goals for the department that no one can understand. It is useless. Um, Initiate discussions that promote high-level thinking. Give somebody an example. Uh, what is high-level thinking? Are we talking about high moral thinking? We're getting into that in this chapter. What sort of discussions would do this? This sort of vague comment is not useful in a textbook, and if you're taking any sort of profession where you have to give advice to people, this is useless as advice as well. Things need to be more specific. One thing that they did state, interestingly enough, in the book is things about ethnic identity, and this is really important because while they're building up their sense of self, remember, adolescents are huge into conformity, but there's an interesting take on culture in this particular country, which I'll use this country as an example, although this psychological effect is visible through all humans throughout time. Some people think that America doesn't have culture. As a matter of fact, we say, well, I like to study like French and Latin so I can be more cultured, as if other cultures have more culture than our culture. And it's a complete crock. As a matter of fact, it might be said that America has more culture than others because we have a vast variety of cultures because our nation is so large. The Southern culture, dramatically different from Northeastern. As I probably mentioned, I did my master's degree down in Georgia, and it is extremely traditional. I mean, I had come from Maine, and by the time I left Georgia after a couple of years, it was very easy to say, you know what? Down in Georgia, there's only one way to do something, the way your daddy did it. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad, you do it the way your daddy did it, and everything will work out fine. And that's how they think. In Maine, there's only one way to do something. However you're going to do it. Just get it done and shut up about it. Because nobody cares. They're a lot more independent, and there's almost no tradition at all in Maine, where it's very traditional in Georgia. That's just an example of the really wide variety of cultural differences just in the one country. And I've even noticed differences, say, between New York and Maine and New York and Connecticut and all these other places. So we're starting to get this identity in adolescence that's widely based on culture, but each child has a variety of cultures that they have to choose from. And as adults, we see it as kind of silly because, like, we'll see a white kid adopting a black culture, and we'll think, well, that's just stupid, although it's no stupider than a black kid adopting a black culture. And oddly enough, they usually miss the American culture because they're trying to separate into one small culture so much that they miss the overall American culture, which is a mix of every culture. And this develops into something called in-groups and out-groups. Now, in 1954, there was a man named Gordon Allport who wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice. And The Nature of Prejudice talked about like the last 100 years of prejudice research. It was a brilliant piece of work. A little dry, but fascinating. And he found out that the very root of prejudice was what he called in-groups and out-groups. I am one of us, and as soon as you start to associate with a group, you have an in-group. Whole group of people that are one of you. And so let's say you have a kid who says, I'm a black male. And he starts to identify as a black male. Now he wants to act like black males. And talk like black males and think like black males. And because of all this, he gets very proud of being a black male. And superficially, this sounds great, right? He's like, no, that's what you are. You should be proud of what you are. Clinically, by the way, that's a crock. You should not be proud of what you are. You should be proud of who you are. But if you're proud of being black, then, well, honestly, that's just silly. It's the color of your skin. It's your ancestry. It's not who you are. It's just it's what you are. and you should be more proud of what you have become. That's a sense of pride. That's your accomplishment. You didn't accomplish being black. You didn't accomplish being a male. That's just kind of what you were saddled with when you were born. You shouldn't be ashamed of it by all means, but it's not something for pride either. But people do this. They will find this in-group, something that they belong to, especially because of this radical desire to conform, and they'll say, okay, I am a black man. I want to act like black men. I want to talk like black men. I want to be in the social network of black men. And so they'll become very proud of being a black man, and as soon as you become proud of your in-group, it is only natural that you will look at people who are not part of your in-group and think that they are worse than you. They are somehow, because you're good, because you are in this group, therefore people who are not in this group are not as good as you. This is the root of prejudice. This is the root of racism. I mentioned in Maine there wasn't much racism. Why? Nobody up there considers themselves white. They just don't. If you were to have them write down 100 things that describe themselves white, probably would not even hit the list of 100. Therefore, they can't look down on blacks because they don't even see themselves as white. They might put American, they might put maniac. That's what people from Maine call themselves, maniacs. They might put what town they're from, but their ancestry just would never occur to them. So they won't look down upon people with other ancestry. And we do this in the most basic of levels. We will have in-groups of I like the Mets. I'll go Yankees instead, just because I have no idea what sport the Mets play. But I'm pretty sure the Yankees are baseball. So you'll say, okay, I'm from New York. I like the Yankees. That is my group. That is my in-group. Yankees fans. Therefore, Boston Red Sox suck. Why? They're the other guys. So we even do this stupid in-group and out-group thing up into adulthood. With literally almost anything. I've talked to people doing martial arts myself. I've talked to people that I'll say, tell me about your specific discipline. And it doesn't matter what discipline they are. They can say, I do Tai Chi, I do Shotokan, I do Taekwondo, I do Shaolin Kempo or Capoeira, any of the different variety of forms. And they will think that their form is the best and all the rest are inferior. Now you take that natural human tendency, add that to the narcissism that I spoke of last time, and you get a huge tendency for prejudice as the main basis of personal identification that these kids are getting for themselves. And this is somewhat problematic. This is why you have an advantage in kind of steering your children, in pushing the children, in encouraging them. No, don't adopt a black culture. Adopt an American culture, because if they adopt the black culture, they're going to be prone to be prejudiced against those that aren't. Don't adopt a white culture. Don't adopt a rap culture. Don't adopt a thrash metal culture. Don't adopt a surfer culture. By all means, have the friends, but don't take it a part of who you are as a person. And if all your friends are taking this thing as who they are as a person, maybe you need better friends that have a better sense of identity. And this will lead them to be less prejudiced individuals in the long run. Now, the next thing in the book is Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Know it, read it. I'm not going to go over it. They go over it very well in the book. They mention sex differences and moral reasoning. Now, during adolescence, the sex differences alter quite a bit. And so now that we're talking about moral reasoning, sex differences come into play quite a bit. And we're not talking gender differences of how you identify. This is actually the sex differences, whether or not your pink bits are innies or outies. And these kind of affect your social standing and your in-groups and out-groups and all this sort of stuff. So they affect your moral reasoning. And this is something that we have always known. For example, your very thought patterns will change. There was a researcher named Geert Hofstede, Geert. I think it's Hofstead. And he had something called the dimensions of cultural differences, which, in more of a cultural class, we get into that more. And everybody knows something of Geert Hofstede's dimensions of cultural differences, because everybody knows, for example, that it's just common knowledge that Japan is a collectivistic state and we're individualistic. You know, they kind of think as a group and we think as individuals, and we all know that. This actually came from Geert Hofstede, and he had a variety of different dimensions of cultural difference. Individualism and collectivism was just one of them. But one of them that he had was masculinity and femininity, which people have tried to change the name because they were slightly offended by the terms masculine and feminine, which is silly in my opinion, but that's just opinion. It's just a name. But more importantly, it's a reflection on the fact that males and females do think of things differently, and there's nothing wrong with this. One isn't necessarily better or worse than the other, and if you identify as that, then that is unfortunate because you'll look down on the other gender. And his dimension of masculinity and femininity was really fascinating, because he had masculine cultures being ones that were about power and dominance and innovation. They're always a lot of competition, always striving to be the best, be better than everybody else. And the feminine cultures were more into nurturing and taking care of people, and more into tradition than they were into innovation. And honestly, the best examples of both masculine and feminine cultures are right here in this country, because the U.S. of A. is by far the most masculine culture that has ever existed. We are all about dominance and innovation. It is currently said on the global marketplace that we lead the nation in innovation. It doesn't matter if we can't build anything because everybody's shipping their labor overseas, but we can design it. And we will innovate, and we will have the biggest and best, and all the other countries are going to have second-rate technology compared to us, and that's just a fact, because we're so big into the masculine idea of innovation. We don't care about tradition at all. At the same time, the Native Americans, which psychologically isn't really that accurate of a term, because as long as you're born here, you're native to the continent of America, but there's no better term for them. But the Native Americans were a classic example of a very feminine culture. They were huge into tradition. Even when white men came over and introduced guns and basically, well, not basically, completely superior technology, because Indians were still a Stone Age society. They didn't adopt it because that wasn't the tradition that they have. They weren't into innovation. They weren't into conquering. They wanted to share the land. They wanted to nurture their people. And ultimately, when a feminine culture and a masculine culture comes together, the feminine culture will have no desire to conquer the masculine culture, but the masculine culture will walk all over the feminine culture. So the masculinity and femininity, the differences, the sex differences in moral reasoning have been known for hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, you have Freud's stages of psychosexual development, which is the last thing I'll get into for this particular lecture, because she skips it. I really expected her to get into it at some point in the semester, and she never does. The author never gets into Freud's stages of psychosexual development, probably because they're not very touchy-feely. So I'll get into them now so you can know they'll be on the test. Freud had different stages of psychosexual development. The idea was that sexuality drives us. It's a huge motivating factor. But sexuality is expressed differently and felt differently through different periods of your development. So as a baby, you have oral as your sexual development. So the babies want to put things in their mouth and explore things with their mouth, and kind of like Erikson's stages, where they're very dyadic. They have, you can do it either really well in this degree or really well in this degree, and if you do too much in either degree, you're basically messed up. Freud has very much the same thing. So you can either encourage your child too much to put things in their mouth, in which case they'll become orally fixated, which is something that we've all heard, oral fixations, or we can kind of shame them into putting something, kind of like initiative versus shame and doubt, kind of shame them into putting things in their mouth all the time. Don't put that in your mouth, that's dirty. And then they'll just think that everything's dirty, and they'll be afraid of everything because they were never allowed to explore as a child and explore this sexual impulse that they have. At about the age of 2, they start getting into the anal stage. And this is, as a psychologist, I can't help but laugh every single time somebody describes themselves as anal. I just have to giggle. Because what they're talking about is anal retentive. This is the idea that when you're potty training, your sexual self turns to the anus in either holding in excrement or letting it out. So if you take a great deal of pride, too much pride, in keeping in your feces, you become kind of a control freak. You're getting pride in an over sense of control, and so you become anal retentive. If you don't care about this, and instead you take pride in getting your diaper changed and crapping all over the place, then you become what they call anal expulsive. And then essentially you'll grow up to be the opposite of anal retentive. You'll be a huge slob. And so they're really drastically different things. Then you get the genital stage, where if anybody's ever seen a 5-year-old, you'll notice that a little 5-year-old boy is just playing with his penis constantly. You're constantly trying to tell him it's not appropriate. You don't do that here. Put that thing away. It's not going to fall off. You can let go anytime. And so they're constantly exploring with their genitals, as I mentioned before, interested in the genitals of others. And by the time you get to middle childhood, they go into the latency stage, which I did mention last week a bit. In the latency stage is where they're not really interested in any sort of sexual thing. They're just learning. They're more. He called this the school age, because this is about when children went to school back then. They start around 7 or 8. And they hit the latency stage for a few years before puberty. But once puberty kicked in, well, now you have your final stage of psychosexual development, where it's not just genital, it's actual sexual behavior. Your sexual gratification is from having sex, from being attracted to members of the opposite sex. So you get this whole social dynamic going into play now, and this is where you get moral development. Now, a lot of people look at Freud's work and they scoff at it and they say, "Oh, that's stupid. No little baby likes to poop. They don't get sexual satisfaction. That's heresy. Blasphemy, I say." But the fact of the matter is, it's absolutely ridiculous to assume either what babies do or do not feel, as was mentioned before. We don't know whether it's sexual or not. We would have no gauge of knowing. So to say that it isn't is just as silly as saying that it is. Yes, it makes us uncomfortable. We don't like to think of babies as having any sort of sexual impulses whatsoever. But, let's not be too arrogant and assume that they don't. Because that would be arrogant to assume that they don't have any sort of sexual development. Not only that, but Freud was right. The fact of the matter is, how you go about with oral development, how you go about with potty training, how you treat the child when they're playing with themselves constantly when they're 5, how you do this drastically affects the child's personality. And by the time they get into this adolescence, they get into the moral stages, which is what he said, and it's been totally backed up. Freud has been backed up. Fine, maybe it was or was not sexual, but that doesn't matter. The stages were real, and the effects were real. Now, he had kind of an interesting perspective with moral development. Which a lot of people know, is the Oedipal complex. For those that don't know, I'll go over it. For those that do, you'll probably learn something new, because this is weird. He felt that during puberty, the young boy has a mother and father in the house, and because he's going through puberty, he's going to be attracted to women, like I had mentioned last time. And of course, the mother is there, so he's going to be attracted to the mother. That's the woman he sees all the time. Of course, he's going to be sexually attracted to the woman that's there all the time. And so that's where his fantasies are going to be. So he's going to try to pursue the woman. And it's going to be very obvious, very fast, that he cannot possibly win his mother's affections. And that is because his father is there. And his father is 10 times the man that he is. He's a small 12-year-old boy. And this is a man. He knows man things. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's smarter, he's more experienced. There's no way he can compete with Dad. So, finally, he learns that instead of competing with Dad, what he can do is try to emulate Dad. He can try to be like learn to be a man. And this is the first real moral problem that the young boy has to go through. And by solving this moral problem and finally deciding that he has to copy his father and learn to be a man so that one day he can pursue a woman similar to his mother, as worthy as his mother was, then he solves his moral problem, and this teaches him how moral development works and makes him a moral creature. Freud actually felt that women were amoral creatures because they never went through this particular problem of wanting to have sex with their father, although later on he did change the story and he had something called the Electra complex, which was basically the female version, except it didn't lead to moral development. It led to the father causing some distance because of some sexual tension. But the idea was females don't have any morals because they didn't have this problem, so they never had the opportunity with the Oedipal complex to develop moral reasoning skills. Now, obviously, in this case, we know that it's crap. That part is crap. Women do have morals and ethics. But like Geert Hofstede said, they work differently. They're going to have different priorities. They're not going to be as worried as much about innovation. They're going to be worried more about tradition. They're going to be worried more about nurturing and helping other people and being social than they are about stepping on other people to get ahead. And this is just how they think, and it's not necessarily better or worse. So we'll start the next one up next time and finish up this chapter for the test.